Hey everybody, my name's Nate, if we haven't met, and I'm so happy we get to be together. People watching in other places, welcome as well. Couple thoughts. This is very, very unique, but next week, we're always trying to figure out, well, what do you do? We're gonna have 8 Christmas Eve services, and then what do you do with your normal weekend when it backs right up? So do not, if you're a Saturday night attender, please don't show up on Saturday night. If you're a Sunday morning attender, don't show up on Sunday morning, because we could not figure a way to offer 8 Christmas Eve services and do our normal services. So no typical service on Saturday night or on Sunday morning, but what we will do is we will begin our first Christmas Eve services on Sunday night, a week from now. We'll have 2 that night, 2 the next night, and then 4 on Christmas Eve itself. And then I know that those of you who are here, you're typically people who, you're just a big part of this church. In many ways, this is one of those services, it's like the backbone of the church. Could you consider, I know it's not quite the same not going on the 24th, but last year we had well over 13,000 people come attend our Christmas Eve services. If you could consider coming on Sunday or Monday, that would be helpful. The whole heart is this, is we want people who maybe come to church once a year or a couple times a year to have a seat to be able to come, and most of those will come on Christmas Eve. So please consider that, and thanks. I know there's a ton of people who are offering to help as well, because with 8 services, there's all kinds of needs with kids and ushering, so thanks for doing that. So last week, we began this series looking at Jesus as King, and we looked at the idea of why so many people missed Jesus arriving as King on planet Earth. It was because of Old Testament prophecies and expectations. And then there's 2 layers to Jesus being king. The first one is he came to be king of individual hearts and minds, to establish a kingdom that had not been in existence since human beings had to leave the Garden of Eden. And he came to redeem and heal and set free and create a new set of values and a new community, a new family. And then one day he's coming back, and he will be King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and nobody's gonna miss it that time. I wanna look at this idea of Jesus being king over this service and our Christmas Eve services as well. I want us to look at the book of Matthew. And the book of Matthew, we're gonna actually begin studying this. We'll jump into more of Matthew in January. But the book of Matthew is very unique. Matthew is one of Jesus' disciples. He's probably the most highly educated out of all the disciples. When you read the book, the language he uses, the vocabulary, the Greek vocabulary, he's probably a scribe, and he's also working for the Roman government as a tax collector. So he's probably very, very advanced in education, and he writes his book in a very unique way, and his primary audience originally were Jewish people. And so he wants them to understand that Jesus is king. Now, 2 of the books that chronicle the life of Jesus deal with Jesus' genealogy. Luke does it, but Luke follows Jesus' genealogy through Mary. And Matthew follows Jesus' genealogy through Joseph. And what we're going to read in a little bit, I fully understand, because I've felt the same way. If you've ever read the Old Testament, you got to Matthew and you're like, I thought we were done with the long list of names that I can't pronounce when I read. But Matthew says, oh no, I'm bringing back the long list of 41 names, and he does so for a very distinct purpose. When you've read it, you read it and you go, I know there's more going on here than I can get. And indeed, it's because Matthew is packing his genealogy. This is essential for him. So in our modern world, we still ask this question, where do I come from, right? Where do I come from? What's my ancestry? I remember not long ago, my uncle took a DNA test, and I'd never taken one. I know a lot of people do this. And he passed it on, and I could not believe. I've always never had like a specific ethnic identity. And I read through this and I realized, okay, this is my DNA and not including my mother's, but there are 37 different distinct people groups within my genetic profile, including Manchurian, Siberian, Mongolian, Ghanaian, Liberian. Like it just went on and on. I'm like, no wonder I like all food, right? I like it all. Well, this is why, because like I am just a little bit of everything. Now, in the first century, they wanted to know, like, who am I? So people didn't have even last names in the first century. So you were, in the case of Jesus, son of Joseph. Your last name was typically who your father was. And you'll find that even in some of the coolest last names in the world, people from Iceland, like, wouldn't it be nice to be, I'm Thor's daughter, right? Sigmund's son. And so they do that same thing. Our last names, a lot of us have a last name that we're not even sure of the origins, but you know that if you're a Steingraber, somebody in your past probably worked with stone, all right? If you're a smith, somebody in your past was a blacksmith. If you're a baker, that's why you love donuts, okay? Like a farmer, all of these things, typically it was as population began to expand, they said, well, let's give people a last name. Now, my favorite last names are like my native friends. You don't have to struggle with last names that are unpronounceable, like Poetzl, Poetzl. All my life, I've been spelling that out, right? Because people are like, what? You have I just picked out some of my favorite native last names. The Pretty on Top group. Yeah. The Pretty Weasels, the Falls Down, the Bull Chief, and my favorite that I've ever come into that I wish was my last name, Enemy Hunter. Like, that's just cool. It's not like Poetzl, right? It's like, well, I know what your ancestors did, right? That's an awesome last name. So why is Matthew doing this? Well, he's going to give us these 41 names, and it's spanning thousands of years. And he's going to use some numbers because he wants his audience to know 2,000 years ago when they read this, but today, in our day and age, he wants them to know some specific things about what it means for Jesus to be king. Now, let's read through the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1. Matthew says there's something you've got to know before we go to the manger scene, before we go to angels singing and magi and shepherds. You've got to know where Jesus came from. Matthew chapter 1, and I will do my best to pronounce these names right, okay? This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. So he starts his book off bringing in this Hebrew term, the Messiah, the promised one, the one they've been waiting for, the son of David. Now, I highlighted David because all these names are going to be mentioned once or sometimes twice, but I just want you to notice how many times David is mentioned, and that's very, very intentional from Matthew. The son of Abraham. So we're starting at the beginning of the Hebrew people. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac, the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Remember that name, okay? Whose mother was Tamar. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Remember Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. I have another name there. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Solomon, the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam, the father of Abijah. Abijah, the father of Asa. Asa, the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat, the father of Jehoram. Jehoram, the father of Uzziah. Uzziah, the father of Jotham. Jotham, the father of Ahaz. Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. Manasseh, the father of Ammon. Ammon, the father of Josiah. And Josiah, the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. 2/3 of the way there. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel. Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, the father of Abihud. Abihud, the father of Eliakim. Eliakim, the father of Azor. Azor, the father of Zadok. Zadok, the father of Akim. Akim, the father of Elihud. Elihud, the father of Eleazar. Eleazar, the father of Matan. Matan, the father of Jacob. And Jacob, the father of Joseph. Notice this, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Thus, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David. So Matthew's going to divide this up. He's going to give us 3 sets. There's 14 generations from Abraham to David, and 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, this really traumatic experience where Israel is invaded and prisoners are taken, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. Okay, 14 from the exile to the Messiah. So, what is Matthew doing here? Why is this so important to him? If you're gonna write a book about the life of Jesus, if you were gonna do that, you wouldn't start with a genealogy, would you? But it's very important for Matthew because Matthew wants everyone to know who Jesus is, and especially if you were Hebrew, you would read this and some things would stand out very, very poignantly. Matthew is going to use multiple literary devices. So we just know in the first century, there were literary devices that they used, and it wasn't meant to in any way be deceptive or anything like that. It was a way to communicate very, very unique ideas. So let's look at this. We'll break it down. First question is this. Let's ask, who is included? Because there's some very unique things that are included in this. Here's the number one thing that would stand out. And you can look all through first century genealogy, second century, previous to that. You will not find genealogies that include women. So ladies, let's hear it. Matthew goes, I want to list, in fact, I want to list 5 women. But here's the funny thing. Matthew does not list the matriarchs of the Hebrew people. That would have been typical if you were going to list women in one's genealogy, because Hebrew culture was very patriarchal. Okay, so it's about the man and who's the father of who. But he does not list your typical women. You would have listed Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel. If you're going to list women, those are the women you would list because they were part of the origin story of the Hebrew people. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Jacob and their wives. This is who you would mention. But instead, here's what Matthew does. He lists 5 women, one being Mary, and then the other 4. They're just not people that you would prefer to be associated with. They're not like Sarah and Rachel and Rebecca and Leah. So he lists them. He goes, here's the 5 women. Number 1 is Tamar. If you want to read more about the story of Tamar, it's in the book of Genesis chapter 38. And this lady's life is just filled with pain. She's a widow. In that day and age, if your husband died, it was you're so vulnerable. And so the law said that then the next older brother, the brother of your husband, would then marry you and take in your children. And they refused to do that. This family wants to abandon Tamar. And so Tamar feels quite desperate. And so she knows something about her father-in-law by the name of Judah, who's one of the 12 original sons, right? One of the tribes of Israel. She knows that he'll be an easy target. So she disguises herself and dresses as a prostitute and sleeps with her father-in-law. Now, anybody who's imagining that in your mind right now, just stop, okay? You're like, ooh, right? So she sleeps with her father-in-law, becomes pregnant, and he didn't know it was her at the time. And then she says, it's me. You treated me unjustly and you left me as a widow with no way to support myself. And by the way, she's a Canaanite. So she's not even a Hebrew woman. And then you have Rahab. You read that in Joshua chapter 2. And Rahab, like, this is the term we would use today. She's a sex worker. So the people there's 12 spies, and they've gone into the city of Jericho, and they're trying to figure out, like, God, how are you going to help us invade this? And this woman named Rahab, I don't know why the 12 tribes ran into her, but she probably led a brothel in this very, very large city. And she ends up rescuing them. So she's a Canaanite as well. She's not Jewish. She rescues them, and then she's included in the genealogy of Jesus. Ruth. So Ruth, there's a whole book with her name on it in the Old Testament. And the thing about Ruth is she's a Moabitess. Like this, you just go like, well, what's the big deal with that? Well, the Moabites, their origin story is Lot, Abraham's brother, had an incestuous relationship with his daughter, and the result were what they called the Moabites. And so they were like completely despised by the Jewish people because their very origins came out of this scandal story. And then the last one doesn't actually list her name, but it was the wife of Uriah. This is Bathsheba. And so this would be probably the most familiar story to many of us. 2 Samuel 11. King David has his group of mighty men who are kind of like his generals, and they're off fighting, and David is he's being passive. He's supposed to be out leading his troops. He stays home. He sees a woman named Bathsheba bathing. It's a little bit hard as you read the story to know exactly what's happening, but there's a sexual relationship, an adulterous relationship that begins. This is one of his general's wives. She becomes pregnant while they're away at battle. David tries to cover up his sin. It's like this big scandal in King David's life. And he has Uriah the Hittite, again, non-Jewish. Uriah the Hittite murdered. And Bathsheba becomes the father of David's successor, Solomon. And so one of the things, like, we just read this and we're like, oh, nice. I am telling you, if you were a first century Jew, you would read this and you're like, what? Like, I remember looking, my grandmother, before she passed, had a literal family tree on the wall in her house. And it was a tree with branches. And like, there was one branch that just stopped. It had one person's name and then everybody else. I'm like, what's the deal with that? And my grandma goes, well, he was a horse thief and they hung him, right? And you're like, huh, okay. And you know, like, that might not be one of your highlights, right? Like, this guy right here, yeah. Matthew interjects into his genealogy women, which was like unheard of. And he does not include the matriarchs of the Jewish faith. Instead, he introduces these women and say Jesus came in part through these 4 women. Here's another thing you want to look at. It's the emphasis of David. David's mentioned 5 times, over and over. So this is a little bit technical, but this is not like secret Bible code stuff, okay? Like, those books, don't read them, right? They're bad. But this was a very real way that Hebrews wrote, okay? This meant something. They did it very purposeful. So there's this thing called gematria, and gematria is the Hebrew language doesn't have, you know how we have Roman numerals? Anybody, like when you watch the Super Bowl, it's been too long, and you look at it and you're like, 34, 50. But we all know they mean something, right? I still know 10. I get lost after that. Well, gematria was this. They didn't have Roman numerals, and their number system was, it was just different. And so in Hebrew writing, remember, there's no vowels whenever you write it. So it's just all the consonants put together with little breath marks. And so you had to insert the vowels as you're reading it. And that's why I got to see in Hebrew. So they use this term called gematria, where every letter in the Hebrew alphabet had a corresponding number. So in English, it would be A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, and so on. So David, you just have 3 letters in Hebrew because there's no vowels. It's the dalet, the vav, and the dalet. And the dalet is the 4th, the vav is the 6th, and the dalet is 4. So if you read that, here's what you knew. 4 plus 6 is 10 plus 4 equals 14. So first century Hebrew people, like you just knew the number 14 stood for David. Because David was the apex. David, even though like there's this scandal and the end of his life is a little bit messy, it was the one time in their lives where they were secure, where they had a godly human being leading. They had defeated their enemies. They were economically prosperous. And so people, even though it had been centuries, they still like longed for someone like David to come and lead them again. And here they are under another occupation, this time Rome. And so like David's mentioned 5 times on purpose, because here's what Matthew wants them to know, is that Jesus is going to be your king. Now, it's not going to be what you thought. Like he's going to tell the story. He's going to talk about like Jesus having to flee as an infant, Mary and Joseph take him to Egypt. But Jesus is indeed going to be king because he is the son of David. So I know that's a little bit like, like you're like, what? Here's an example. If you're a basketball fan, I refer to number 23. Who am I referring to? Yeah, you said it so politely. Michael Jordan, okay? If you're a Bronco fan and I refer to number 7, who am I referring to? John Elway, right? Okay, so that's kind of how this worked in the ancient world. They looked at that and they're like, oh, 14, David. And so the 14 is not necessarily important. It moves into this next thing where Matthew wants everybody to know what is happening, that Jesus is going to be the king, and then he gets into this. He wants to break up this whole thing into 7s, okay? So at the end, he says, so there were 14 generations, right? From Abraham to David, 14 from David to Babylon, and then 14 from Babylon to the Messiah. So the 14 isn't what's really important. The important is 7s. So you've got 2 groups of 7 in each one. There were 7 generations, all right? 7 generations from Abraham, another set of 7, all the way until we get to David. And then we've got 2 more groups of 7. Okay, so we're going to count the 7s. You've got 2 of them in the first 3, 2 in the next, and 2 in the next. So it's a total of 6. Well, why that? One of the things that we totally missed in our Western minds is when Matthew writes this at the very beginning, he says, this is the genealogy of Jesus. He uses the wrong Greek word. He uses a word that is, this is the beginning. This is the beginning. So what Matthew is telling his readers is this. This is a new beginning. There have been 6 groups of 7, and the 7th one begins with Jesus. And what he's getting at there is this. This number 7, all of Hebrew culture is built on this. We get from Genesis chapter 1. There's 6 days of creation, and on the 7th day, what does God do? He rests. It's complete. Matthew's saying this. For these 6 groups of 7, God has been working through human history, through failed, broken people, through things like exile in Babylon. And now at the birth of Jesus, we're at the 7th day of a brand new thing that God is doing. We've reached the age of fulfillment. 7 days to create the world, 6 sets of 7 to create the person of Jesus in the moment when the Messiah would finally come. This whole 7 is so important. Matthew just puts it into this. So you have every 7th day is a Sabbath. It's a day of rest. Every 7th year is a Sabbath year. Where like, anybody would just love this. It's like every 7 years, you just get to take it easy. How many people would just dig that, right? like partial, like retirement for 1 year. And so God set that up. I want every 7 years, I want you to leave the land. I don't want you to plant. I want you to learn to trust me. So it develops trust. The seventh day you don't work, you trust me. The seventh year, you don't work, you trust me, I'm gonna care for you. And then after 7 cycles of Sabbath year, there's the 49th and the 50th year is this year of Jubilee. The 49th to 50th year is the year of Jubilee where like everybody's debt is eliminated. It's this beautiful combination of what we call capitalism and mercy. Work as hard as you want for 49 years, but here's what you gotta know. Your rotten kids don't get to inherit whatever empire you built. It's all going back to the original owner. And so it's this leveling year where all debt is forgiven. And so Matthew is telling his readers this. We don't get it when we read it because it's just too obscure. We don't understand gematria. But he's saying this, when Jesus was born, Jubilee. He's the seventh. There have been all these 6 eras throughout human history, throughout Israel's history, and now we're entering the 7th where everybody's debts are going to be forgiven. Jesus is the Jubilee, and he's going to take this debt that everybody in that lineage carried. All 41 people carried this debt to sin and failure, and when Jesus comes, it's Jubilee. Every failure is going to be wiped out. Every sin is going to be conquered. Everything that you owe God is dealt with in total and complete when Jesus arrives. So you have this emphasis of the number 7. So, well, there's more we can go, but here we go. We'll just move into this next one. So, gotta ask this question: who is excluded? Because if you took all the time and walked through all the Old Testament, you would come away going, wait a minute. There's 3 names that aren't mentioned that were in the lineage of Jesus. And here's who they are. They're 3 kings that completely turned their back on God. And so basically I think what Matthew is saying, hey, by the way, I didn't mention 3 of the kings who totally denied the existence of God. One of them worked for Egypt. I just think Matthew's saying this: God even found a workaround. He has this plan going. He just worked around these 3 guys. We're not even going to include them in the genealogy. And then under this idea of what is excluded, there's 2 names that have been changed. And maybe some of you read that and you're like, what? So there's 2 names that are changed. Asa, who wasn't a good king, depending on what translation you have, Asa has been changed to Asaph. And then Ammon has been changed to Amos. Now, some of your Bibles, like the NIV, thought, oh, that must be a clerical error, so they changed them back. But I think this is what Matthew's saying. They're reading it and they're like, wait a minute. Where's Asa? Why does it say Asaph? Where's Ammon? Why does it say Amos? So here you have 2 people. He just changes 1 letter in each of their names in Greek. Asaph, if you ever looked at the Psalms, he writes the majority of all these worship songs that you find in Psalms. All this collection of prayers to God, these poems anticipating God, dealing with injustice and pain. He's saying that Jesus is fulfilling all the longings of worship in the Old Testament. And Ammon becomes Amos, and Amos is one of these, there's a tiny little book in the Old Testament. He's one of the prophets, and he's the prophet of social justice. He's the prophet that comes against brokenness within the church, and he comes against empires that hold dominion over people. He's the one who addresses injustice. And Matthew's a brilliant guy. He didn't make a little spelling error. He's just communicating to them who Jesus is. And then here's the one thing that like many of us caught. Okay, so there's the 3 groups of 14. The last one, anybody notice? There's only 13 names. Like, what? Matthew, your math got messed up. Remember, he's a tax collector, so he's probably pretty good at math. And here's what he does. It's just this little nuance, which is going to lead us up. We're going to talk about this for Christmas Eve services. Matthew 1:16, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. What's been the pattern? The father of. So he comes here and he just leaves 13 names. Joseph is not the father of anybody. Joseph is what? The husband. He's going to adopt Jesus and raise him as his own. So there's only 13 fathers in that last grouping. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So Mary is the mother, Joseph is the husband. And so we'll talk about this, as I said, next week. But Matthew is just introducing this idea that Jesus didn't have an earthly father. There were 41 names that followed a pattern, the father of, the father of, the father of. And when it comes to Jesus, there's Joseph, who's the husband of Mary. That God is doing something, entering into the human story. And it's where we get this word Emmanuel from. God with us. God with us. Okay, so there's all this. As Westerners, we read it and we're like, I don't know. But in the end, here's the question. What does this mean? Because we have 2,000 years of history. I don't know if you've been to Israel or anywhere in the Middle East, you just understand within moments, this is a very, very different culture. There's an ocean that separates us. There's culture that separates us. There's 2,000 years that separates us. So I just want to end with this. So what does this mean? What does this mean? Right? Some interesting little facts, but what does it mean? Number one is this. Matthew's trying to tell us that Jesus' story is our story. Jesus' story is our story. So for 2,000 years, people have been reading this. And part of what Matthew wants you to know is that your name could be added to Matthew chapter 1. That Jesus was the father of everyone who gave their lives to him, and he created new life within them. And so the genealogy continues to the 2,000 years of history, of church history, and that we get to this point, and somehow my name is added to this, and Jesus was the father of Nate. And he gave us new life. Matthew is presenting this idea, even by mentioning these women who are not Jewish, that what Jesus is doing is he's gathering together more than just Jewish people. And he's creating a new family and a new kingdom. And here's how we often present this in the North American church, is we say something like this, like, hey, why don't you invite Jesus to be a part of your life? So you'll hear this phrase. You'll never hear me say this phrase because I'm very uncomfortable with it. Would you like to invite Jesus into your heart? And here's why I'm comfortable with that phrase. It's like so North American. Like, whose heart is it? It's mine, right? And I'm just going to invite him in. Jesus, you can take the attic room, and when I need you, I'll call. It's this very tame way of saying, hey, that Christianity is something like this. It's like, this is my story, this is my life, and I'm gonna try to ask Jesus to be a part of my story. Jesus doesn't wanna be a part of my story. He's asking me to be a part of his story. Amen. Right? And so I'm not asking Jesus into my heart. If I understand what Jesus' message was, is like, am I willing to rip my heart out, my broken, beat up heart, and give it to him? And say, Jesus, I don't need you to be a part of my story, and come bless me. I am surrendering everything. I'm believing that there is new spiritual life in you. I give you my heart, and I am trying to be a part of the story of Jesus, right? Don't just invite Jesus into your story. There's a story that included those 41 names and tens of thousands and millions of people, and Jesus says, come be a part of this story. This story that I'm writing in the first chapter is the beginning on that Christmas day 2,000 years ago. Secondly, what do we take away? Simply this: Jesus can use anyone and anything. I love that Matthew, this good, proper Hebrew scholar, just wants to include all the mess. Because you could have edited out all the stories. You could have just said, no, let's just stick with Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah. Like, those are good names. And Matthew says, oh, no. Let's invite all the scandal into it. Let's invite some stories about like incest. And let's invite some stories about widows who are in pain. And let's not forget to include like the downfall of David and how God's gonna use Bathsheba to be a part of this messianic line. So part of the story for Matthew is like people over and over just feel like there's been too much damage. There's so much dysfunction in my past. It's in my family history. It's current in my life today. Like I couldn't be used. And part of what Matthew's saying is this: there is no giving up when it comes to God. It doesn't matter how tragic your story. It doesn't matter how profound your failure. Is that God can use anyone and anything, and he does that. And God is still using anyone and anything, and there's no need to walk around with secrets in my life. God can use broken, selfish people. God can take people who are addicts and people who have morally compromised, and that wasn't part of his plan, but he says, I'm not scared of that. Bring it to me. As I work through all the dysfunction of the Old Testament to get to this day where Jesus could be born, I can work through all the dysfunction in your Old Testament so that we can write a New Testament for your life. God can work through anyone and anything. And here's the third and final thing. God's hand is on human history. So, he lays all this out from Abraham, right, to David to exile to Jesus. And if you interviewed Ruth, or you interviewed Rahab or Tamar, centuries before, do you think any of them would have said, hey, you know what? Man, I like this horrible life that I'm living as a sex worker, Rahab, like I think I'm a part of some significant story. I bet not. I bet there was a lot of regret and a lot of pain. If you talk to Tamar, who's like terribly desperate, and we're not even talking about half the names in there were like people who just, their lives were total chaos. The men, there's plenty of kings who like just ruled in horrific fashions. Like the story just goes on and on. Nobody knew that they were part of what God was doing on planet Earth. God's hand is on human history. And that's what Matthew is saying is like, okay, this is a new creation story. I'm not even gonna use the word for genealogy. I'm gonna use the word for beginning. This is the beginning of Jesus. And as we're living our life and painful things happen and like we either hurt people or we're victims of people and it just goes on and on. Here's all I can tell you is Matthew is saying this: God never stops working. It may take way longer than you thought. And man, maybe the story got like, it went from G to PG-13 or worse. And God doesn't give up on that. And he worked through all of these people's lives and none of them had any idea what was happening. There were a few that had a promise, like Abraham had this promise from God. He held on to it. David had a promise that was given to him, but both of their lives kind of came apart. But God never stopped working until he could get to the place where he's always wanted to be. And I'd say this, like anybody, if you've been following Jesus, you pause and you look over your shoulder and you look at like everything you came from and everything that was wrong, and you realize, God, thanks for never giving up. Thanks for pursuing me and orchestrating my life. Maybe you're in the midst of the chaos. Here's what I know. God will work through that. He works through that. His hand is on human history, and his hand is on our history. Jesus is king. And it wasn't a sanitary story. It was a story that involved tragedy for the Messiah to enter into the human condition and become king. Will you pray with me? When we think of you being king, Jesus, it's intriguing to consider all of the brokenness represented by those 41 names. Like the Old Testament is just filled with it. But you worked through it all. And here's what I pray, that we would remember that you will work through it all. And that you are king. You're king, and nothing can ever subvert your power. I pray for any of us whose story, or maybe it seems as it's just chaos. Would you remind us right now? No, I'm not giving up. I'll ride around what just happened. I'll redeem that failure because I want to bring you to this place where Jesus is king. And I just want to make this invitation for anyone. If you're ready and you'd say, hey, today's the day. I want to make Jesus king of my life. You just raise your hand and wave at me. Not asking him to be drug into your story, but you to join his story. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, okay. Yes and yes. Anybody else, if that's you? All right, absolutely. I'm left, you're right. Yes, sir. Yeah. If you're in the balcony, will you wave at me? Okay, yeah. All right. Amen. Amen. Would you applaud for those who just made that decision? It's beautiful. So you didn't invite Jesus to join your story, you just joined his story, right? Go all in. Hey, if you need a Bible, there are Bibles. They're free at the Welcome Center. If you're a guest, we have a gift for you. I'd love to put that in your hands. If you need prayer for anything, there's people up front you can trust. Go and be the hands and feet and mouthpiece of King Jesus. God bless you guys. You are loved.